The reason I share my story is that my great-aunt passed away a few weeks ago. Now, as I rethink my memories of her, I begin to realize how messed up everything was. I was 20, and my great-aunt was 88 when she passed. I wasn't related to her by blood. She was my maternal grandmother's brother's wife. They were quite wealthy. My great-uncle had been a well-known lawyer, and my great-aunt came from a rich family. They lived in a large house near one of our capital's old canals. They never had children, partly because of their workaholic lifestyle and love for traveling, but I think there were also fertility issues. My great-uncle had been in feeble health for years after suffering from a couple of intracranial hemorrhages after retiring, which left him quickly tired and a very slow speaker. He was still the most intelligent person I've ever met. After he died, my great-aunt became even more clingy, always wanting us to visit her. My aunt lived about 2 hours away, which may not seem like a lot, but it was still the other side of the country. My parents were busy with work, and my siblings and I, being young, weren't very interested in visiting older relatives, so we didn't see our aunt often. When we did visit, probably once every 2 months, she was always happy. It made me feel guilty, but she had a large social circle. She was quite the socialite, coming from old money. She would spoil us children, though we teenagers had to fake our enthusiasm when gifted jigsaw puzzles and antique books on German grammar, which we didn't speak very well. She had her cook prepare elaborate meals, and they were always delicious. After dinner, we would all have tea and biscuits in her living room, talking endlessly. She would mention a friend battling cancer again or discuss her recent visit to a gallery opening, always wanting to know how we were doing in school. She would ask if I planned to attend university in her city. My aunt was a bit obsessed with tea, always serving exotic, sweet flavors that she insisted we taste and analyze thoroughly. Looking back, I realized the pattern in what happened next. After dinner and tea time, we would become drowsy. My father usually drove us home in the evening, which I now see was dangerous. Sometimes we had to spend the night at my aunt's, making us more hesitant to visit her. She would call and whine about how lonely she was, and we felt obligated to go. I remember one time when I was around 14 or 15, my brother became very ill during our visit. We had to spend the night because my father had a decent amount of wine, and my mother was too tired to drive. After breakfast, again accompanied by my aunt's tea, we visited a museum while my parents slept in a bit. While we were in the main hall, admiring a painting by our country's greatest artist, my brother threw up all over the security fence in front of the painting. It barely missed the artwork, and we were quickly escorted to the bathroom by a panicked security guard. My little brother looked awful, pale and throwing up every few minutes, his vomit becoming clear and a little bloody. The guard suggested calling an ambulance, but my aunt refused and insisted on taking us home. It was a 10-minute walk, and my brother threw up 2 more times in the canals while a few drunken British tourists cheered him on. My parents were worried, and since we were all feeling a bit nauseous, they suggested taking my brother to a doctor. Again, my aunt refused, putting him in her bed and drowning him in blankets and hot water bottles. She said something like, "Oh, maybe you should stay a few days for him to get better." My parents insisted we leave, so we got in the car and drove home. By the time we arrived, my brother felt a lot better, so he didn't see a doctor after all. Then came the moment I finally realized something was wrong. About 2 years ago, we visited my aunt a few days before Christmas. I had just had my tonsils removed and it hurt like hell. Everything was fine when we arrived. After the usual talking and eating, I barely touched my food because swallowing was nearly impossible. My aunt insisted I drink some tea, but I couldn't have anything hot, so I kept declining. That evening, I remained remarkably clear-headed despite my pain medication. However, I noticed my family becoming a bit drowsy. They spoke slower and more incoherently, complaining about being tired by 10 p.m. I thought that was odd, especially since I felt alert. I chalked it up to my discomfort from hunger and not participating in the dull conversations because of my pain. I often think now, if only I had said something. After my aunt's funeral, my scattered family gathered to remember her and share stories. The tiredness and sleepovers were mentioned frequently by my uncle, his wife, my cousin, and my parents. Everyone became uncomfortable, but we brushed it off since she had just passed away. Now I'm almost certain something was in her tea. The only time I didn't feel sleepy was when I didn't drink it, despite her constant insistence. I suspect she wanted to keep us close after her husband died. I did some research and think it might have been some kind of coping mechanism. I don't bring it up because she's gone, and I don't know how to voice such an unbelievable accusation. It makes me both sad and angry. Sad because she was obviously lonely and wanted her family close, but also angry because she took enormous risks. It could have ended very badly, especially with my brother and the children getting the same spiked tea as the adults. When I was 3, my mom left. I was 13 when my dad met Tammy. I wasn't the most confident kid. Chubby, small for my age, and still carrying baby fat. My dad and I shared a love for Star Wars, comic books, and science fiction, and he was my best friend. At some point, my dad decided he was ready to meet someone new. He was lonely, and I thought having a mother figure might be nice. This was before online dating, back when people still placed ads in the personals. My dad wrote one, and not long after, he met Tammy. I remember how happy he looked when he told me about her. After a month of dating, he decided it was serious enough to introduce us. We were going out for dinner and a movie, and my grandma helped me get ready. I was nervous to meet her. She seemed nice at first, but even at that age, something felt off. We went to Sizzlers, and my dad told me to order whatever I wanted. After a while, he excused himself to the bathroom. As soon as he left, the atmosphere changed. I smiled at Tammy, trying to be friendly, but she cut me off, telling me that my dad had been letting me eat whatever I wanted and that I was a fat little piggy. She made pig noises right there at the table. I wasn't even that heavy, just a little chubby, but her words stung. I was crushed. She ignored me after that, acting nice again when my dad returned. For his sake, I pretended to like her. I wanted to tell my dad what she'd said, but I didn't want to upset him. He was my best friend, and I couldn't bring myself to ruin his happiness. I hoped he'd realize what kind of person Tammy really was, but he didn't. Their relationship continued, and by the time I was 15, Tammy moved in. That summer, I lost my baby fat and shot up to nearly 6 feet, taking after my dad, who was 6'3". Puberty hit hard, and my voice was cracking all the time. I made it a point to avoid Tammy as much as I could. I'd go to school, come home, and stay in my room until my dad got home from work. But Tammy always found ways to get to me. She'd say cruel things, calling me stupid or a loser, and she never missed an opportunity to make me feel small. When I told my dad, he brushed it off, saying we all needed time to adjust. For the next 3 years, I endured her insults. They got worse as time passed. She started doing things like putting glass, paper, and sand in my food. Just my plate, no one else's. I refused to eat anything she made, terrified she'd poison me. Around this time, she and my dad got married. When graduation finally came, I was relieved. I had enlisted in the Army and was set to leave for basic training in July. But of course, Tammy wasn't done with me. My recruiter received an anonymous call claiming I smoked pot and did drugs. Thankfully, I passed my drug test, but I knew it had been her. A few nights before I left for boot camp, my dad threw a big party for me. Tammy tried to cancel it, claiming she was sick, but by that point, my dad had already invited everyone. She pouted through the whole thing, and I could see my dad starting to notice her behavior. A few years passed, and I got deployed twice. After nearly 2 years without seeing my dad, I was eager to visit. He'd mentioned in our calls that their marriage was falling apart. She was controlling, verbally abusive, and just a few weeks prior, she'd knocked him out with a cast iron skillet. He'd given her a month to move out, or he was going to throw her stuff out. The night I got home, it was late. My dad picked me up from the airport, and when we got home, Tammy was supposedly staying at her sister's house most nights, moving her things out. My dad and I ate and then went to bed. Around 1 in the morning, I felt the bed shift. I was exhausted, and assumed it was my dad's dog, Caesar, a German Shepherd. Then, I felt hands around my neck. Instincts kicked in, and I flipped the intruder over, pinning them down. My dad rushed in, gun in hand, and flipped on the light. It was Tammy. My dad called the police, filed a restraining order, and served her divorce papers. A lot more happened after that. She even destroyed my dad's new Mercedes. But I won't bore you with those details. What matters is they divorced and I never had to see her again. So, Tammy, let's not meet ever again. My mom is the youngest of 7 girls. Her oldest sister is 20 years older than her, and all I knew about her was that she had untreated mental health disorders. My mom hadn't spoken to her since she was about 10 years old. To be honest, I didn't even know this aunt existed. One day, when my brother and I were 6 and 7, my parents sat us down. They laid a photo on the table, showing us a woman I didn't recognize. They told us that if she ever tried to talk to us around the neighborhood, we needed to run to the nearest house and call them immediately. They said she was dangerous and that we should treat her like a stranger. My brother and I exchanged confused looks. After all, this was my mom's sister, but we nodded, trying to absorb the weight of their words. Fast forward about a year, and my family was at my cousin's basketball game. My cousin was the daughter of the aunt in the story. My aunt had walked out on the family about 10 years prior, so I didn't expect to see her. My brother and I begged my mom to let us get something from the snack stand. We headed over and stood in line, excitement bubbling between us. Suddenly, I felt a tap on my shoulder and turned around. There she was, the woman from the picture. She greeted me with enthusiasm, saying she was my aunt. I froze for a moment before replying with a hesitant, "Hello." I didn't want to be rude. She turned to my brother and greeted him the same way, but he didn't respond. She then suggested that since the line was so long, she could take us out for ice cream. I didn't know how to respond. This was my aunt. I couldn't just be rude. But my brother interjected, insisting that we had to go back to our mom now. She leaned in, her voice filled with urgency, claiming that our mom said it was okay and that she would never hurt us. Panic flooded me. I blurted out that we had to go. I felt her grip tighten around my wrist as she began dragging me toward the door, my brother by my side. I didn't yell. I just froze, confusion mixing with fear. Then I heard my mom's voice piercing through the chaos. She was shouting for someone to let us go, identifying us as her kids and demanding help. She came sprinting across the court, panic radiating from her. I had never seen that look in her eyes before, a mixture of fear and fierce determination that made my heart race. In an instant, people rushed to intervene, separating us from her and pulling us back into my mom's arms. Later, I learned she had been charged with attempted kidnapping. My mom pressed charges, and we now had restraining orders against her. Even now, at 23, I can't shake the memory. My cousins took us out for food afterward, and I don't remember much about the police, just telling them what happened. As I grew older, I learned the reasons behind my parents' warning. My aunt had been blackmailing them, demanding they pay her bills, phone, rent, medical expenses, while sending disturbing photographs of our house and of my brother and me, claiming she would take care of us if the money stopped. Her grabbing us at the basketball game was right when my mom and dad approached her ex-husband, a lawyer, about the blackmail. They were devising a plan to protect us. Now I work as a secretary at my mom's office. A year ago, I answered a call that shattered the routine of my day. The caller was my aunt again, asking if my mom was available. Her voice dripped with familiarity. I managed to tell her I was sorry and asked if I could take a message. She informed me that she was a free woman now and that she knew where my mom was and where we all were. Then she hung up, leaving me in a whirlwind of fear. I rushed to tell my mom, who remained calm, assuring me that it was okay and not to worry. But deep down, I knew the truth. I still feared that my aunt might find me, that she could show up at any moment. Let's hope I never see my aunt again. I had known this woman since before I could remember. She was good friends with my mom and dad through high school, so I already knew her before all this. Unfortunately, my mother was an alcoholic and pill addict, leading to years of neglect when I was very young. After missing most of my third grade year, DCS got involved, and my dad gained custody of me. He was dating stepmother at the time, and initially everything felt fairly normal. She seemed like an older sister, a friend. Before long, I noticed things changing. One day, when I was about 9, I sat on the living room floor, my back against the couch, playing quietly. Stepmother crossed the room to go down the hallway and appeared to shoulder-check the doorway. Suddenly, she turned and began yelling at me, accusing me of pushing her. I stared at her in disbelief. I hadn't moved from my spot. She continued yelling, and I tried to make sense of it. Maybe I had gotten up without realizing it. But why would I push her? I felt no negative feelings toward her, so her accusation made no sense. She was an adult, and I was just a child. Surely she knew what she was talking about. Stepmother was a tall, skinny woman with long golden blonde hair, straightened with poofy 80s bangs. She often wore high-waisted jeans and kept her long, pristine red nails. Those would later become a horrifying symbol for me. Things worsened as I got older. I occasionally spoke to my mom over the phone or in letters during the first few years, but each time I did, stepmother became more hostile, claiming my contact with my mother made me misbehave. I was an introvert who loved reading and school, a bit of a nerd, and I hated getting into trouble. This accusation felt nonsensical, but what could I do? Before long, I noticed stepmother looking for any opportunity to treat me however she wanted when we were alone. She quickly became extremely militant. Each morning, she woke me up for school by bursting into my room and aggressively jerking the covers from my body. Some mornings, she even grabbed my feet, digging her nails in and twisting my toes. I was expected to follow a strict schedule on school mornings. 6:15 a.m., out of bed. 6:15, 6:25 a.m., get dressed for school. 6:25 a.m., breakfast. I had to stand in the exact center of the threshold between the kitchen and dining room, ready to take my breakfast and sit in my spot at the table. 6:35 a.m., done with breakfast. 6:35 to 6:45 a.m., finish getting ready for school. 6:45 a.m., be sitting cross-legged in the center of the living room, waiting for everyone else to be ready. If I didn't follow this schedule down to the minute, punishment would follow. She would grab my hands while I took my breakfast, twisting 1 or 2 fingers out of their sockets, pulling me close to grit her teeth at me with glaring, hateful eyes. Sometimes she would stomp on my feet, grinding her heels into my bare skin, twisting and glaring hate into me. On a few occasions, she broke my wooden hairbrushes across my face, leaving busted blood vessels and massive bruises. When the damage was too obvious, she would try to hide me for a day or so, gently waking me the next morning and acting as though I was sick, brushing my hair back and telling me to go back to sleep. This treatment rolled into my afternoons, evolving into other aggressive behaviors. She made sure to conceal any signs of mistreatment from my father, but some instances happened right under his nose. At the dinner table, she would dig her toes into my leg, scraping so hard that she shaved off chunks of skin from my shins with her toenails. Even at church, she would place what looked like an affectionate hand on my back, then proceed to give me an extremely painful pinch, leaving huge bruises that no one else would see. After school, I was given an hour and a half to do my homework. After that, I was expected to entertain her daughter. Stepmother's daughter was between 5 and 7 when things started to escalate. I had to play what she wanted, when she wanted, and abide by any requests. This was never said explicitly, but understood and learned the hard way. One summer day, while having lunch with her daughter in the playroom, she asked me to open her dessert. She had a kid cuisine with only 2 bites taken from it. Stepmother typically left the plastic on her dessert to encourage her to eat dinner first. When her daughter asked me to open it, I asked if she was done with her meal, passively pointing out that she had barely touched it. At about 14, I thought it seemed reasonable to big sister her. But when I didn't give her what she wanted, she huffed off to tattle to her mother, as most 6-year-olds do. Stepmother was immediately enraged, barreling down the hallway toward me. I don't think I was out of view of her daughter when she grabbed me by the hair and started dragging me. I tried to keep up but lost my balance and fell to the floor. She continued to pull me down the hallway by my hair. Once we reached my bedroom, she started kicking me in the stomach and then pulled me to my feet to face my bed. She rummaged through my belt drawer, pulled out a woven leather belt she had already used more than once, and proceeded to beat me with it, starting at my shoulder blades and going all the way down to my ankles. If I screamed, she would beat me more. The abuse didn't stop with the physical. She seemed to enjoy bullying me, which she wasn't worried about hiding from my father. She made it seem lighthearted when he was around. One evening, while having family dinner at one of our local go-to spots, she started kicking me under the table, passing me horrible glares. After a few minutes, she spoke up, saying I chewed like a cow. She laughed and asked my dad why I couldn't chew right. He chuckled, thinking it was lighthearted, but when he looked back down at his meal, I saw her death glare staring a hole through me. This became a new target for her abuse. Later, she noticed I walked on the inside of my house shoes. One day, she kicked me in the back of the knees, making me fall to the floor. She began kicking me in the back, knocking the wind out of me, all simply over the way I walked. This became my daily life. Speaking out felt ridiculous. All these punishments seemed absurd. I didn't tell anyone for a long time, but as I grew older, people around me became wiser. In middle school, my dad and stepmother were called in for questioning by the school. 2 of my teachers were suspicious of my bruises and swollen fingers. Stepmother put on an act, crying and pretending to be shocked that anyone could think she would hurt a child. I changed schools after that year. Things only worsened once I reached high school. Stepmother seemed intimidated by my growing maturity. Male friends were off limits, and she insisted I hide my curves in unflattering clothes. I didn't mind too much. I had little interest in boys or showing off my womanhood. One afternoon, while taking a shower, she burst into the bathroom to remind me about my timing. As she whipped open the shower curtain, she saw the hair growing below my waist. Before I could react, she grabbed the hair and yanked it down, pulling out a handful of my pubic hair. She cursed me for not telling her I had started maturing. I couldn't tell anyone about that for years. After the belt beating, stepmother's sister-in-law saw my backside and called my dad at work, threatening to report him. After that, I started spending weekends at her house. I began to feel braver, less afraid. Once I noticed people reacting to what little they saw of stepmother's behavior, I knew I was right to stand up for myself. So I did, subtly at first. I brought jewelry and makeup to school, finding space to express myself. Then one morning, running a minute or two behind on breakfast, stepmother came to the kitchen in a rage. I was rinsing my dishes when she rummaged in the utensil drawer and pulled out a fork. She backed me against the kitchen counter, pressing the fork to my throat. I don't remember her exact words, but I remember her hot breath in my ear, hissing through her teeth, and the chill of the cold metal on my throat. I was 16. My last day there was field day of my junior year. I chose a cute outfit that her sister-in-law had bought for casual days. A cap-sleeved, striped t-shirt cut to suit my curves and long matching shorts. I knew she wouldn't like it, but it was appropriate for my age, even conservative compared to my peers. As I walked down the hallway toward my bedroom, I saw the rage fill her face. She came at me, nails first, grabbing my arms and digging in. This was when I snapped and fought her off, shoving her against the wall. Rage filled me as I went to the living room to grab the phone. I declared that if she touched me again, I would call the cops. Her face went pale. Suddenly, I wasn't scared for myself anymore. I couldn't control my laughter as I realized she was the one who was scared. Her face went blank as she walked toward me, and with a cold stare, she said that if she had to make my dad choose between us, it wouldn't be me. I ignored her. It was delusional to think she could manipulate him that way. I marched to my bedroom and packed a bag. She didn't stop me but made sure to let me know that if I left, I wouldn't be welcome back. That summer, I spent time with stepmother's sister-in-law, and I eventually moved in with my grandmother for the next several years. I saw stepmother again only once in my 20s. By that time, she had left my dad for the man she had been cheating on him with. We spoke briefly over Facebook, and I confronted her about what she put me and my dad through. Her response stung. She said she was sorry if I ever felt unloved, that she had been really stressed, and that I was a pretty rebellious kid. There was a lot that happened within our family before this event, so let me explain. My mom's brother, whom I'll call Clark, had been married to this woman for over 20 years, and they had one child together. Growing up, I was always told that my aunt was a little off and instructed by my mother to stay clear of her whenever possible. She seemed pretty normal to me until I was around 10 when she started harassing my mother and my grandparents. She would hit on my grandfather, show up at their house unannounced, and occasionally try to start fights. We had to block her on all our phones, and my uncle was told she was no longer allowed on our property or our grandparents. Years passed with little issue, but for the past few years, she had been mentally abusing my uncle and my cousin. Once, in a fit of rage, she even urinated on the floor right in front of my cousin. Since then, my cousin had moved out. With all that background information out of the way, let's get to the main story. It was Christmas Eve a year ago, and, as per tradition, we were having dinner at my grandparents' house. The guests included my grandparents, mom, dad, brother, uncle, cousin, and their dog, Holly. We sat at the dinner table, which was in view of the front porch windows, when the doorbell rang furiously, followed by loud pounding on the door. When we looked over at the windows, we saw her. My uncle got up and went outside to talk to her. From the table, we could hear some yelling, and just as my uncle opened the door to come back in, she grabbed the dog and threatened to take it away if my uncle didn't give her money. At this point, my parents were outside watching along with a few neighbors. Then my uncle got in the car with her. Before she drove off, she yelled that everyone was looking at her, claiming she knew she was beautiful and that God loved her. After that, she sped off. We all stood at the windows, stunned and confused, while my cousin texted his father to check on him. He let us know he was okay, and that he was going to an ATM to get her some money so they would leave him alone. About an hour later, my uncle returned with the dog. He told us that she had basically held him hostage because he hadn't given her enough money. But after a bit of bribing, she finally brought the dog back, and I hadn't seen her since. The rest of the night was filled with tension. I watched the road behind us all the way home, scared that she might be following us. Since that incident, things had escalated at their house. We discovered that she was doing drugs and had been cheating on my uncle for a while. For those wondering why we didn't call the cops, he told us not to. I don't know why, but he hadn't done much about her aside from saying he wanted a divorce, though nothing had come of that. So here's hoping that crazy aunt who has threatened my family lets us not meet again. When I was 10 years old, I received a letter in the mail. I loved the idea of receiving snail mail. I opened it to find a drawing I'd done for a class exercise, a flamenco dancer. I had thrown it in the bin at school because I didn't like it. At the bottom was a simple sentence, "You're a talented little girl." I felt naive for enjoying the compliment. I showed the letter to my mom, who called my teacher. She seemed concerned about where it had come from and left it at that. Later, she confessed she was scared because my teacher hadn't sent it and didn't know who would. A few weeks later, I was home alone, a very rare occurrence, when I noticed someone twisting the doorknob. Only someone with a key could open it, so it didn't budge. Someone slipped a letter through the crack underneath the door. Fear gripped me at the way the letter had been delivered. When my dad came home, he opened it. This time, it was a letter saying someone was going to gift me a new tennis racket, because I was so good at the game. At first, my parents thought it was one of their friends wishing me a happy birthday and promising a gift, but it wasn't. Now they were getting uncomfortable. 5 more letters came over the course of 3 months. One even mentioned my taste in books, expressing pride that I had read 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. On the surface, the letters were benign, filled with congratulations and pride, but they were creepily worded and delivered anonymously. Around this time, I got my first phone. I played in a lot of tournaments and my parents couldn't always attend. Then the phone calls started. Sometimes there was just static, sometimes breathing, sometimes a low laugh. Other times the voice repeated "hi" over and over. I always blocked the numbers, but they always returned. The numbers changed, but the area code remained the same. My parents were deeply concerned. They stopped my tournaments, hired a guard to stay outside our house at all times, and checked in with me every hour. If I missed a call, they would send someone from one of their offices to check on me. A week went by like this, and my parents noticed a small hatchback driving by our house every morning, like really early, around 5 a.m. most days. I didn't understand why they never took down a plate number. Finally, they called the police and talked with them at length, but nothing came of it because there were no substantial anti-stalking laws in the country. My brother and I were on high alert from then on. We hired a full-time guard and help at home. My mom got cameras installed outside. My dad spoke to our neighbors, explaining the situation so they would be cautious too. Both my parents worked for the government, which gave them more authority and resources to keep us safe. When the landline received frequent calls, my dad answered one. He calmly told the caller to stop what he was doing. The man responded with a deafening screech before hanging up. Shaken, my dad decided to put an end to this. He took all the letters to a private facility to have them fingerprinted. Several prints were found. My dad then took the prints to the police and had them run. He was in charge of police administration at the time, so no one asked any questions. The prints belonged to my aunt's husband, verified against his voter ID. Let me give you a little background about him. My aunt was married to a man who had schizophrenia. I only learned about this a few months ago, after my 18th birthday. It was an arranged marriage. In the 60s in India, the parents of the bride and groom typically set it up. They got along fairly well and eventually had a daughter, whom I'm very close to even today. Now I live in the US, but these events took place in India, where the mental health scene was lacking. People with mental illnesses, particularly those like schizophrenia, were often shunned. They were spoken about in hushed whispers, locked away in rooms, and physically cared for but emotionally forgotten. After my aunt and uncle married, his first symptoms began to show. My aunt wasn't thrilled. There was a prevailing feeling that the groom's family had duped ours by not revealing that the illness ran in their family. Here's where I was horrified. My grandparents and aunt thought they should abandon him on the streets because of the stigma associated with mental illness. During his episodes, he violently abused my aunt, my cousin, and even their little dog. He became a monster. Of course, that's no excuse, and their attitude was incredibly uneducated. My mother, who worked with mentally ill and homeless individuals, stepped in and chastised them for their plans. She ensured he received psychiatric care, medications, and therapy. This all happened before I was born, and by the time I arrived, he was doing well. However, I always tried to avoid him during visits because he had this strange smile that made me uncomfortable. I later learned that it was a side effect of his medication. Throughout my childhood, I suppressed my discomfort and scolded myself for thinking those terrible thoughts about someone I considered innocent. Apparently, he started flushing his medication down the toilet the year I turned 10, and he became obsessed with me for some reason. That explained the 5 a.m. drive-bys. He would do them while my aunt thought he was at the gym. He knew our address, my phone number, and had access to many of my pictures from my aunt and others in my family. He followed me to the point of going through my school's trash. I've just recently learned all of this. What I actually remember is that my parents became much more cautious about where I went and what I did. I even found it annoying. He had several of my pictures pinned up in his closet, but since they were mixed with my brothers and cousins, no one questioned it. It seemed only natural to love your family. That's my story. I don't think he was a predator. I think he was sick and unstable. My very overprotective dad believes it was his misguided way of being proud of me. I don't hate him or even dislike him, and neither do my parents. We understand the importance of addressing mental health issues properly. My aunt ensures he never goes off his medication these days. He seems to be doing well and just retired from his job this April. My cousin has made peace with his past abusive behavior and understands it stemmed from a poor understanding of mental health. Even now, I see him regularly at family gatherings. He makes lame jokes, and everyone laughs. He's perfectly nice and generally has been a great uncle to me since that time. Sometimes the monsters exist within your family, and sometimes they're not monsters at all.